Hi, I'm Dale Franks, and welcome to episode 1 of what may or may not be many episodes of QandO TV. You see, I've got this cool video and photography equipment, and I go out and shoot pictures, and I do photo shoots and stuff like that, but I very rarely use it for myself, just to have fun and to see what the capabilities are. So I thought that I would try to start off something called QandO TV and do some video blogging and just see how it went. A couple of interesting things have happened this week that are kind of important in the blogging world, and I guess important in the news world as well. Number one is this conference in Copenhagen on global warming, which appears to have essentially fallen apart without any real agreement of any substance going to be met or going to be agreed to. It's been an interesting week in terms of climate science because we've learned a couple of fascinating things. Number one, what we have learned in the aftermath of the Climategate deal is that some of the raw data has some problems with it in terms of how it was generated, how it was massaged, rather, to generate the underlying data that has supported all of these anthropogenic global warming claims. Now, before I go any farther, let me be clear about one thing. The Earth is warming. The Earth has been warming since about 1850, the end of the Little Ice Age, and we've had constant warming ever since then. It was interesting, when I was in Alaska, they had a map of Glacier Bay. We'd gone to Glacier Bay to see it as part of our cruise, and the U.S. Park Service presented us with a map that showed the extent of Glacier Bay from 1750, when there was no Glacier Bay, there was just glacier. And as the years went by, the glacier sort of retreated back into what is now Glacier Bay. And at this point, there's only about 2 or 3 noticeably large, impressive glaciers there. But the whole thing used to be all of these glaciers coming in to form one massive glacier that entirely filled Glacier Bay. So we know the Earth is warming. That's not the question. The question is, why is the Earth warming? Is it something natural, something that happens as part of the rather variable climate of this planet, or is it something that is caused solely by mankind? Well, of course, many people in the scientific community have signed on to the idea that this is something that is caused by mankind, and mankind alone. But this week, well, we've seen some problems with some of the data. Number one, the Russians have looked at some of the data released by Hadley CRU, and they've noticed that a very large part of that Russian data is simply missing. It's just not there. They only used about, I think it was somewhere between 25 and 40%. Now that I'm on camera, of course, the exact figure escapes me. Go figure. But it doesn't include much of Russia's landmass, and of course Russia, which stretches across 9 time zones, is a pretty significant piece of real estate. For some reason, the Hadley CRU people left that out. We also learned, not this week, but a couple of weeks ago, that the actual data from the Yamal tree rings that were used to reconstruct historical temperatures seems to be, well, a bit hinky. In point of fact, they only used a very small data set from Yamal after a certain period of time. Why? Well, we don't really know. They substituted data sets from tree rings from places as far as 400 kilometers away, even though the Yamal data was there and it was available. So that's an intriguing look at how the data was put together, and it doesn't make much sense, because if the Yamal data was there, why not use it? And interestingly enough, Friday, what is this? I don't have a watch on. Friday, yesterday, the 19th, I believe it was, Michael Mann from the University of Pennsylvania wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where he stated that, well, we haven't used the tree ring data since 1960 because since 1960, the tree ring density does not correspond well with temperature at all for some anomalous, enigmatic reason. Well, one would think it would be important to figure out exactly what that anomaly, that enigma was, since if we know that since 1960 the tree ring data isn't a very good proxy for modern temperatures, why is it such a good proxy for 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago? Well, There are no answers to that question forthcoming, but it's a question I'm very interested in, because if we can't trust the tree ring data now, because the tree ring data does not reliably reflect the proxy readings that it should for our current temperatures, why are we trusting it for the past? So some interesting things in terms of tree ring data. And I know that most of you have just been fascinated by tree ring data all of your lives. As we move on to the last thing that I wanted to talk about tonight, it's this statistical methodology that they've been using to correlate temperatures, modern temperatures. What we saw last week was the raw data from Port Darwin in Australia, which showed the temperatures all pretty much agreeing with each other at the temperature stations in and around Port Darwin. And what we see is fairly trendless data. It doesn't appear that there's been any significant warming. In fact, if there is a trend at all observable in the Port Darwin stuff, it looks as if it is a very slight decline in temperature at Port Darwin. Nevertheless, when you look at the Port Darwin data that was generated as secondary data, the massaged, statistically, quote-unquote, corrected data, what you end up with is a series of corrections that make the actual base temperatures go higher and higher and higher and higher as you get closer and closer to the modern date. And so you go from very little corrections 30 or 40 years ago to corrections of upwards of 3 degrees now for the modern data. Why? Well, that's a good question, and no one seems to have an answer for that one. Why is it necessary, when you have a whole bunch of data from one single location, why is it necessary to constantly apply quote-unquote correction factors to it to make the data look as if the temperature is getting higher and higher and higher, when in fact the thermometers in Port Darwin are saying no such thing? So it's been an interesting week or so looking at the fallout from this Climategate deal, and it'll be interesting as the weeks come and we begin to see more and more of the raw data, and we begin to get an idea of how this data was collated and perhaps statistically massaged. Well, we may get a little different picture about why temperature is moving as it is, and we may find that there are reasons other than the use of carbon dioxide or carbon-based fuels to account for it. And who knows, if we're lucky, maybe in another 4 or 5 years, when we talk about deniers, we'll be talking about the people who push anthropogenic global warming, not the people who think it's a load of bunk. Well, we can only hope. Until next time, I'm Dale Franks. Thanks for watching.